Hi, it's Phil McCauley here from Labour Business TV, and this morning I'm delighted to be joined by Nick Smallman, Chief Executive of Working Voices. Nick, how are you?
I'm really good, thank you, Phil. It's quite the most glorious day, as we've been having every day for the last couple of weeks. It's kind of weird that we're being toyed with extraordinary weather when we're stuck inside.
God bless Al Gore.
God
So here we are. Here we are, in the middle of global warming, talking about the pandemic. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit about Working Voices. Tell us about your company and the impact that you're having.
Sure. Well, I mean, I started it 22 years ago, and you know, it was born out of something I noticed when I was working in the city. I was working as a salesman, quite a lowly job, but I noticed I was relatively good at what I was doing, and there were a lot of people who weren't, and I wasn't really sure why this was. But I started to almost model it and break down the mechanics of why I was managing to get more appointments than others. It seems like quite a basic place to start. But from there, someone suggested that you should really set up a business. You're quite good at this. So I did, and started off in the UK and expanded into the US in 2008, just as the Great Recession was happening. And then in Hong Kong in 2010. But essentially what we do is we go into businesses and we sort them out from an interpersonal perspective. So any organization can be, have a fantastic product. They can be great with their technology. They can have money in the bank, etc. But ultimately what makes an organization really tick are its people. And there are some people, as you know, who are incredibly slick, very, very comfortable in front of the camera, you know, public speaking, town halls, etc. And there are some people who simply aren't. They're smart, they have a lot going for them, they may be great one-on-one, but don't quite have that presence and necessary capability in front of others. And of course, when it comes to leadership, which was basically been most of my work since 2008, that's where I think a lot of people want to start scoring nowadays, because they understand what a visual world we live in, and it's simply not enough to be good at your job. You've got to be good at communicating with other people.
Yes, this is very interesting. And of course, you've done a lot of work with Labour members of Parliament and shadow ministers and teams.
I have.
Before we get into the detail around politics and how your vision could help this kind of aspect leading up to 2024 for Labour, what is it about leadership and communication that's so important?
Well, it's interesting. Someone asked me to define what leadership was a few years ago. And it is communication. They are one and the same thing. If you think about a simple communication process, if I've got something in my head that I want you to understand, somehow there needs to be a mechanism, bearing in mind we haven't got telepathy yet, there needs to be a mechanism for me, for whatever's in my head to get into yours. Now, it's not just that, is it? Because in today's world, you're really distracted, because we're all distracted. So whatever I say needs to be good enough, needs to be clear enough, needs to be accurate enough for you to respect me, take it seriously, find it interesting, maybe want to follow up. Those are skills. It's not something necessarily we're born with. I'm not sure what the ratio between introverts and extroverts are, but what I can tell you is that the vast majority of people need upskilling in any organization, especially as they move into a leadership position. And the way I view Labour MPs is, because they are the elected representative of their constituency, all of them are automatically leaders for that constituency. So their communication automatically needs to be really good.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Now, you had a most interesting journey into political communication with the Democrats during Hillary's campaign. Tell us a little bit about that. What did you discover about how they do communications in the States compared to how we do it here?
Well, America's always a little more advanced than the rest of the world when it comes to the circus, as they call it over there. I mean, I managed to find a way into the campaign via Amanda Renteria, who was the political director. I went up to her after a fundraiser that I managed to sneak into, and just asked her, you know, what the campaign was doing regarding all of its staff. Now, obviously, the candidate has a sort of like a ring of steel around her, and she was almost inaccessible because she was a political veteran, etc. So I didn't think anyone thought it was for her. But what you noticed was that if you're not a professional politician, you would need some help. So there are a lot of people who were in the campaign who were brought in for their expertise, but then had to go on camera. They had to be a good surrogate for Hillary Clinton. And there was a real disparity. So I did a lot of analysis work, really comparing the styles and what strengths and weaknesses there were, and then giving people some tangible techniques that they could use to get better.
Now, in terms of that, if somebody's not that confident at communicating, say they're a great constituency MP, but suddenly they're thrust in front of the cameras, what kind of help can you give? How can they become better at communicating? You have a process for that.
I do have a process. And what's really interesting is how that process has changed. So much of interpersonal communication training at the turn of the century, dare I say it, was all about the physical. How do you stick on kind of an idea? And I have to be honest, when I started, that's very much how I started. But I realized really early on that ultimately the physical was simply an indication of what was going on emotionally. Now, let's be really clear. My sessions aren't in the slightest bit like being with a counselor or anything like that. However, it is a safe space for people to talk about what they are confident at or not confident at, where they think they need work. And interestingly, let's just take fear of public speaking, which is a classic thing for a lot of people. Some people just simply don't rate their ability. Now, MPs have to talk, but let's say they don't feel good about their ability to talk. My view is they need to actually unpack their value, what they stand for, and what they're actually trying to do. What is the mechanism, again, of trying to get something in their head into somebody else's head? And what I've noticed, and this is a little breakthrough for me maybe 15 years ago, was that as soon as you get someone to truly focus on the outcome of the people they're speaking to, it's much more difficult to be self-conscious. So that's my starting point with a simple technique like being nervous in front of the camera. I'm doing it right now. I'm really trying to get you to understand something, and thus it's more difficult for me to be self-conscious. So self-conscious is simply, where is my mind at any one point? You solve that. The technique should look after itself. And I suppose the thing that people like me tend to do is they try and stick stuff on, and I just simply am not a fan of that. I don't think it works, and it doesn't have long-term benefits.
Well, I've taken outcome focused as my main takeaway from what you just said, as I listened intently to what you said, and
yeah.
I get it. So let's just talk about how political communications is going under the Johnson and Starmer era. What's your sense of how Keir Starmer's approaching that? And what's your sense of how Johnson's responding? And what's going to happen next?
Do you know, it's really interesting. I'm always interested in the immediate shift, not only in the press, but in the tone between the leaders when it happens. So it's always quite a seismic event from a communication perspective. And the reason it's a seismic event is because I think unknowingly the culture underneath the leader changes automatically because the party looks to the leader. Now, Jeremy Corbyn had his own set of challenges. One of the things he was really good at was things like authenticity, being a man of principle, et cetera, et cetera. But what he lacked, I think, and what Keir Starmer absolutely has, is that, and it is a gift that he's clearly worked on over time. I have no idea how good Keir Starmer was when he was 20, but his ability to ask a really clear forensic question and then just sit back is actually a really powerful thing to do. And whereas I noticed that Johnson could grandstand with Jeremy Corbyn, obviously he hasn't got the baying mob behind him, which is a real advantage to Starmer because people just have to listen. But secondly, what I'm noticing, it's not so much what Keir Starmer's doing. What he's doing is sort of absolutely 100% professional and vanilla, which is exactly what the country needs right now. What I'm noticing is all the sort of the non-verbal reactions from Johnson, which you can tell he knows he's in a different fight now. And you can tell, it's pretty clear that he's nervous. And also, he's not someone who does detail. Now, Starmer does detail. So again, you've got that clash. Now, in an environment where people want clarity, where there is anxiety, there is this sense of unknown. None of us, we're all sitting here, what is it? It's May the 19th. And we don't know when lockdown's going to finish. We don't know if we're going to get coronavirus. We don't know anything. So to have someone asking really tough questions, but in a really sort of civilized, professional manner, it might seem like a, you know, almost like a revolutionary event in the Labour Party, because that's not where it's been. And I would say that, you know, Starmer's clearly has sort of just natural gifts that I think the last couple of Labour Party members didn't have. Sorry about that, that's my dog running around. Anyway, carry on.
The dog has a natural gift. What do you think is going to be the response? And as the baying mob, as you describe it so accurately, comes back into Parliament whenever the social distancing allows,
yeah,
is Johnson going to have to alter his game plan, or is he just going to go back to his bluffing and duffing routine because he's incapable of anything else?
It's a really interesting question, one I've been thinking about. But actually, I'm not sure he has a plan B. This is the interesting thing about populism. There isn't a plan B. What's fascinating, if you look at Putin, Trump, Orban, Bolsonaro, Johnson, are kind of the sort of the big five regarding populism, and that bloke in the Philippines. Populism totally works when you've been left a good economy, because you can frame everything around the economy and say, well, that's all clearly down to me. What you're also banking on with populism, which I think is really important, is you're banking on the culpability of your base, who will soak it up, use huge amounts of confirmation bias, and ultimately keep giving you free pass after free pass after free pass. The trick, you see, what was interesting is there was an essence of populism about Jeremy Corbyn, and that doesn't work. Two populists trying to fight over the same turf simply doesn't work. What Starmer needs to do is shift everything back, not to the old politics, but to kind of almost like a gold standard view of politics, something we can relate to, an archetype that we can really identify with, that makes us feel safe. Because, I mean, I'm 46. I've never experienced anything like this. Most of the country will never have experienced anything like this. And of course, it's going to get worse. There will be some form. I'm not sure it's going to be a Great Depression, because we have technology on our side, and maybe the ability to do not a V, but a slightly faster trajectory than the 1930s. I think that's possible. But we're going to have a very deep recession, huge amounts of disruption, and we need to feel that someone knows what they're doing. And the fascinating thing about the way Boris Johnson operates is he's managed to get away with it. What the Labour Party needs is someone who'll hold him to account. And from what I've seen so far, that's exactly what Keir Starmer is doing.
It's very interesting what you're saying, Nick. Now let's talk about, I mean, obviously, you know, the whole nation's upset that the Prime Minister had coronavirus, and that's awful, and we're glad that he's well, because we'd like to beat him at the ballot box and not in the emergency
Exactly.
room, of course. And, you know, that goes for all politicians who are in the front line of this as well, and they are out meeting constituency, and they are doing, you know, relatively risky work in engaging the population. It's not true that they're all hiding away. But one of my questions here is, what can we learn about the quality of advice that Johnson is getting? Because it does seem to me that there's a real question mark over Dominic Cummings and his coterie and the sort of pseudo nature of his intellectualism. What do you think about that, and what can be done to challenge this sort of populist pseudo?
Well, it's interesting. The first question one has to ask oneself is, why this advice? Why from this person? And the thing is, almost like the advice has a sort of a double sort of meaning. There's the advice that Cummings or whoever is giving, which they've kind of thought through, like herd immunity was an idea. The problem is they shouldn't have been getting all that out there until they'd actually made the decision. It just looked a mess. So that was the first thing. But the second thing is, with populist advisors, take Steve Bannon, it's about creating almost a brand out of that. So Cummings, you know, well, I mean, to be fair to Dominic Cummings, it's not something he says, but everyone profiling him will talk about his love of history. Now, the thing is, just because you've read a book about some kind of war in the 18th century does not make you an expert on politics. But there seems to be this kind of unwritten, transferable skill from reading lots of history books to being some kind of boy genius. And I simply don't believe it's the case. What Johnson actually needs around him, which he has to a degree, are scientists, strategists, people who can model, so he can simply follow the science. I mean, if you look at the successful countries, they were unequivocal and they did things quickly. Jacinda Ardern, quickly. Trudeau, quickly. Merkel's a scientist. I think she's a biochemist by trade. So you could see that what's fascinating is it's like nothing humans could do could shift these populists from their perch. But then nature just comes along and says, have a virus. How do you like them apples? And then, of course, they've got nothing because, you know, Trump's there shaking his fist at a virus, but you can't tweet against a virus. A virus is, you know, doesn't care. I don't think it's even alive. I think that, I'm not sure but when people talk about viruses, it's just a thing that needs to replicate. So it's very, very difficult for a populist to do anything other than just sort of say, I mean, what I've noticed about Johnson, which again, I kind of get, but I think is slightly ham-fistedly, is his sort of quasi-Churchill / Henry V / this is our finest hour. I mean, he wrote a biography on Churchill, so he's obsessed with the guy, and I think he wants to be Churchill, but I don't think people should be comparing this to a war either. It's not a war. From a communication perspective, it's a health emergency that needs to be dealt with. And of course, politicians love to sort of label or underline things as something specific so we can relate to it. I get that. But it's not a war. And we're not fighting them on the beaches. We're staying at home. and I, you know, so I'm very skeptical of, and I find it upsets me as well that the sort of the populist solutions to the public where they're treated not particularly brilliantly. You know, I hunker for the days of boring because it will, or I hanker for the days of boring. It just so I can feel like I know what's going on. And like, remember, I run a business. I'm trying to game out what my future looks like. And it's quite difficult at the moment because, again, messaging doesn't have to be complicated. In fact, messaging, especially when it comes to something nationwide, it should be relatively simple to understand and digest and act on. And the problem is Stay Alert, which has got a lot of bad press. The problem is it's too vague. Oh. Stay at home, I get, that's an action, but stay alert for what? You can't see the virus. So is it stay alert for other people who may have symptoms? Is it watching surfaces, or is just all of the above? And again, you know, this is sort of what, you know, schoolboy errors, really.
So they've kind of lost their way on messaging, haven't they? Because, of course, Cummings masterminded the whole Brexit fiasco with his Get Brexit Done thing, and that's worked for Johnson's election and all the rest of it. But this confusion in messaging now seems to be a bit off message for him. Why do you think they've lost the plot?
Well, again, they're using an old strategy, thinking it will fit this new problem. Brexit was something where you could rally around the flag, sort of really appeal to a narrow kind of desire in the electorate, appeal to a particular type of social fear, and it worked. Absolutely. But remember, they'd had 40 years of the press slagging off Europe, so they had help. And, you know, for whatever reason, the country was ready to vote Brexit with a massive nudge from, you know, all kinds of interested parties. But this is different. The thing about, if you think about it, Brexit was pure populism. And so the populism worked, even though it was a surprise. This is the opposite. A public health crisis should be the opposite of populism in the way that it is managed. And of course, they play the greatest hits that they know. They want Johnson to come out and start wagging his fist and sort of talking about how great Britain is and we're a confident. I mean, honestly, if someone tells me we're a confident nation again, I'm going to just have to switch the channel because it's so meaningless, so nebulous, so pointless. And it's not good leadership. It's really kind of lazy. And this is also a problem with populism. It's a vague idea. It's not something specific. Real government is long, arduous, full of contradictory gray areas that one has to manage. The problem with populism is it's this binary idea. It's like, which side are you on? Pick a side and we'll go with it. And of course, that's not helpful right now.
So do you think it's likely that the kind of populist era is coming to an end as we enter into what might be described as a new realism, the new realism era coming up now?
Well, that's my hope.
content?
That's my hope. I met with a number of Labour MPs last year, and just to really talk to them about sort of populism. And you know, you could tell there was a lot of concern, like how do we beat Johnson? Because I think Johnson had just won the election. But my point is if the wind is blowing in your direction and you're a populist, then knock yourself out. But if it's not, it's almost impossible to defend, because populism by its very nature looks at things through a certain lens. Once that lens doesn't work and you have to look at it through another lens, populism, it's like the emperor's new clothes. There's really nothing there. I'm not saying populism's dead. What I am saying is that coronavirus is something that populism can't manage, because stats are stats. I mean, obviously, I suppose you can, as a populist, fiddle the figures and pretend certain people aren't dying, or palm it off on other people. I mean, one of the absolute kind of guiding principles of populism is not to take responsibility for what's going on, which is the opposite of leadership. So I hope populism is dying. I'm not sure that it is, but I do think that the Labour Party needs to, you know, build the gravestone of populism that will be hammered into the ground in 2024. But it's a process. What you can't do is wish it away. There needs to be a technical process whereby Labour MPs simply are viewed differently to Tory MPs. And it's not a risky strategy. It's just about a little bit of discipline, good technique, honesty, integrity. I mean, Labour needs to build trust right now, and it needs to create a stark contrast. You've got the Tories over here doing their populist thing, and as long as Johnson is leader, that will happen. And then over here, you want Labour MPs who, when they are questioned, you feel like they genuinely want to give you the answer. I mean, politics has descended in the last, 20 odd years into almost like a blood sport. It's like, how can the interviewer get, who's the hardest interview? Is it Andrew Neil? Is it John Humphreys? Is it Andrew Marr? Was it Paxman? Okay, and how is it that they can get their scalp? So of course the MP, to be fair to the MP, it's tough. They go into sort of some weird sort of shell. I'm just going to try and see if I can get through this, waste time, and not screw up. And if I can do all of that, I've done my job. Now that is not the way to communicate with the British public. If the interviewer asks you a question, the most successful way of managing it is not to say, can I finesse the question and move on to another question? Otherwise, what's the point of the question? The way to manage it is to say, how can I engage not only with the question, but the questioner? Because if I engage with the questioner and the question, I'm engaging with the people who want to know the answer. Now, that sounds like a really obvious idea, but you'd be surprised how little it happens in British politics. And I think that's kind of an interesting thing.
Completely fascinating. And finally, I know that you're a very keen activist and observer in American politics. And as we face November and the Trump circus, what's your take on that at the moment? What are you observing? What's your sense of where that's going?
Well, several things. I think the first thing that I would say is, it's interesting they ended up with Biden. It shows that the Democrats are desperate to win. I mean, I don't think Bernie Sanders, in my view, would have been successful, not because he's not a politician full of conviction, he's good on the stump, but in America, socialism has a very, very different connotation. I mean, they've grown up with years of kind of propaganda around socialists are literally evil. So that's not a good idea. They've ended up with Biden. I've always worried about Biden as a candidate, and that really doesn't make any difference whether Biden is 78 or 48. I think he's a really poor candidate. However, he is the candidate they've got. If they build a decent machine around him, I mean, mind you, he's managing to do everything he needs to do without doing anything, because Trump is kind of having to manage his crisis rather badly, and he's, there are some very strange utterances coming from, from the White House.
What's your message to the Labour Party as it looks for its new General Secretary and it reorganises for the 24th year of election process in this century. We're looking at digital, we're looking at digital communications, we're looking at the speed of message, rebuttal, all those areas. What does Labour need to do to win in 2024?
Okay, there's the interesting bit, okay? There's the interesting bit and there's the boring bit. The interesting bit, kind of people do to a degree, which is they work out what their message is and they kind of start delivering a higher quality of communication, which is, you know, to a degree where I may come in. The complicated bit and the important bit is never done, which is where's the infrastructure to support not just what the message is, but how that message is delivered, to get some kind of continuity from all the MPs and anyone involved in the messaging in the party. How does that come to the fore in internal discussions? The next thing I would say is start really early. The idea is that most of the work that you need to do in order to upskill all your messengers, and there's hundreds of them in the Labour Party, to the desired level, and to give people the confidence they need, it needs to start between sort of 2020 and 2021. By 2022, the Labour Party should be more efficient, more authentic, be seen as a party with more integrity, more ideas, etc., than today. But that just doesn't happen by asking 200 people to randomly get better. There needs to be process, there needs to be structure. And if you think about an MP's job is to communicate. That's their job. They communicate on behalf of their constituents in Parliament. They answer questions, they write stuff, they're on social media, they give speeches, they give interviews. But what's really interesting, if people in my organization had that much press, I would make sure that they not only, you know, as they say in the theatre, you know, remember your lines and don't bump into the furniture. But I would also say that where's their guiding principle? Now, the great thing is, with Keir Starmer taking over, you have a guiding principle. Because you have someone who's a really good example. And I think the thing is, you know, if people call him, you know, slightly boring, etc., again, I think that works right now. And I do think, you know, there's plenty about Keir Starmer that will come out over the years as people get to know him. But what you don't need to do at a time like this is start introducing Keir. No one's really that bothered right now. They just want to know that they've got an opposition that can hold the government to account. The introducing Keir will happen over time. It'll be incremental. The key is he doesn't want to give the press any ammunition, which he isn't. He wants to be competent, which he is. He wants to be a change, which he is. But all that is fine cosmetically. But if there's no structural change, the Labour Party will be in roughly the same spot in 2024 that it is in 2020, because they haven't actually decided to create an infrastructure to give people that support.
Nick Smallman, thank you very much for your time today and stay safe during the pandemic.
I will. Thanks for having me, Phil.
Cheers for now.